My name's Pamela Clifton. I'm the Communications Coordinator for the Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition. And first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for allowing me to share the story of how my children were impacted by my incarceration. Our experience, which is not unlike millions of others whose children have been devastated by parental incarceration. In 1997, my husband died a few short weeks after his 40th birthday from a cardiac arrest on the kitchen floor. And unfortunately, I was ill-equipped to handle that on every possible level, and I self-medicated using illegal drugs. A short time later, I was arrested for possession of a small amount of drugs, and my attorney at the time said that if I could successfully complete an inpatient substance abuse treatment program, that I could probably avoid going to prison. But I couldn't afford to go to an inpatient substance abuse treatment program. And so I was given a 6-year prison sentence with a 3-year mandatory parole for a total of 9 years, because I did have a prior felony conviction for a serious car accident from the 80s, late 80s. Now, I've always taken responsibility for breaking the law, but the response from the system was more like hitting a fly with a sledgehammer, because it really wasn't necessary to put me in prison in 1998. It was just the automatic thing for the system to do, and my kids were taken from me, and they were put into foster care with strangers, because I didn't have any immediate family in Colorado that could take them. My son Dalton was 4, my daughter Ashley was 7, and prior to this, they never had any behavioral or mental health issues or anything like that. The last time I spoke with them at that point was July 17, 1997. They were put on a fast track from foster care into adoption. So I was at the point from my incarceration, I was not allowed to speak to them, I was not allowed to call them, they weren't allowed to visit. We were allowed to send a couple of letters. I was able to send them a few pictures, a book on children's grief and loss, and a few handmade quilts, and that's all they had to remember our family by. But you can't know how sickening it is to not know every night, sitting in that cell, wondering whether your kids are okay, or whether they're safe, or whether they're happy, or are they being abused, are they alive, and would anybody ever tell you if they weren't? So they put both my kids up for adoption. After a few months, the foster parent said, well, we're going to keep the boy, but we don't like the girl. We're going to send her back, because she's a bit of a handful. And Ash was a handful, because she knew who her family was, and she remembered her mom, and she kept telling them, my mother's going to come back to get me. And because of that, they put her through 23 foster homes and group homes and a maze of psychotropic medications over the next 6 years. When I went to prison in 1998, I was 3 months pregnant, and on Christmas morning, I went into labor. I went to the prison guard and was told by the guard at the time, I told her my contractions had gotten to 5 minutes apart. And she told me to get back to my room, back to my cell, my unit, because there were plenty of women down there that knew how to birth babies. I was left alone in my cell, and 2 days later, when I was able to see the doctor, they rushed me to the hospital because they were no longer able to detect a fetal heartbeat. And my 8-month-old daughter died just trying to be born. She wrapped the cord around her neck 3 times and tied it into 2 knots. So you can imagine sitting there trying to deal with the grief of all that, and then receiving a letter from social services saying that my parental rights for Ash and Dalton had been terminated, and I would never see them again. And I needed to write them a goodbye letter so that they could get on with their lives, even though I didn't know what their lives were like. After I was released from prison, I successfully worked really hard to get my life back. I completed everything that was asked for me. I spoke to so many attorneys, asking if there was some way that I could at least try to get my kids back, if there was any avenue available. And they told me, no, not in Colorado. Once your rights have been terminated, you won't ever get them back. But I continued to contact social services for some sort of word on my kids. Could they at least let them know where I was if they needed to contact me? And they would never reply, or they'd say no. And so you can imagine my surprise one day when I got a phone call and they asked me if I wanted Ash back, because she was a bit of a handful. When she came home, she was 14, and she was an absolute mess. and we went through a lot of treatment and a lot of things, and we still deal with that today. But when we went before the judge, I asked him, I said, I thought once your parental rights are terminated, that's permanent. You can never get your kids back. And he told me, no, anything can change. Now, as soon as Dalton's new family found out that Ash had moved back in with me, they cut off all ties between them, which started a whole new wave of grief and trauma issues that have had severe and long-lasting consequences. Ash and Dalton found each other through social media, MySpace, or I think it was MySpace at the time, and they kept in contact with each other secretly. And when Dalton turned 18 and graduated from high school, he called me and said, Mom, can I come home? And I went and picked him up on July 17, 2012, which was exactly 14 years to the day. Now, the trauma that my kids endured is incalculable, and we continue to work on the issues that were created and the damage that was done unnecessarily by the system, because the consequences of parental incarceration and the impact on our kids is the real travesty. It's the most devastating unintentional consequence, and the one that is the most overlooked. We have to remember that 2/3 of the people that are in prison have at least one child. And in Colorado alone, that is 18,000 kids that wake up with a parent in prison. And I don't know how this has affected all of them. I do know how it has affected the 3 in my life, because I didn't need to go to prison. What I needed was to get help. I needed to get treatment. I needed community support services that were available and the opportunity to utilize alternatives to incarceration that would have allowed me to deal with the mental health and substance abuse issues that I was going through. It would have allowed me to get my life back on track and raise my children in a healthy, loving environment instead of the trauma, chaos, and disruption that social services forced them through. And my 3rd child, Leah, she might not have died. So I work for an organization called CCJRC, and we've successfully worked for alternatives to prison, drug sentencing reform, and expanding treatment funding. Because this means that there are more parents at home raising their children right now. And we supported legislation last year that addressed the issue of children languishing in foster care being reunited with their parents after their rights had been terminated and their parents had dealt with their terminal issues. Because something has to change. We have opportunities to allow family impact statements to be introduced prior to sentencing so that the needs of the children and families are taken into account, because there are alternatives to incarceration that can be explored. Real community-based alternatives that have solved real problems in real people's lives in real time. Because we believe that being a part of a family matters. And it's a relationship that should be honored and treated for the precious thing that it is. Now today I've brought my son Dalton with me to explain his version. And thank you very much for having me.